4:15 and time to begin the next speaker. Appreciate all of your attendance. Brother Mark Wright from California, Seminary Institute teacher, will talk to us about Gleaning the Glyphs, textual tidbits in the Book of Mormon. He is one of the few people who understand some of the glyphs that the Maya Indian has wrote their language after the classic times. Brother Wright.
It's almost impossible not to make a mistake. It's just to talk about you the first 15 minutes. I told him to do that.
The title of my presentation is Gleaning the Glyphs. When they called me a couple months ago to ask me if I would speak at this conference about my glyphs in the Book of Mormon. And at that time, I hadn't really given the subject a whole lot of thought. And I could think of a couple of glyphs, and so I'm like, well, when I give them a title, I better not overpromise too much. But as I went through and prepared this, I discovered lots. And so, see how much we can get through. Less than a month ago, a remarkable new discovery was published in Science magazine that all but proves the Olmec had writing 3,000 years ago, which is centuries earlier than any other New World writing system. It's exciting to see a growing corpus of text that corresponds in time and place to the Jaredite period in the Book of Mormon. We cannot yet translate these glyphs, but in time more text will emerge, and hopefully one day we will be able to decipher these ancient texts. This was just published on September 14th in Science magazine. Has been in all the papers, New York Times, LA Times. And we know that it's, whoops, can we go back one? We know that it's writing. It's a little bit different than the other writing systems discovered so far, because it seems to go in a linear fashion, which is not something that the glyphs typically do. But there is a similar sequence, and so we know that it is writing. For example, we have this little bug guy, and then this little flower, and up here we've got the bug guy and the flower. So there seems to be syntax and everything else. But this text dates to Jaredite period, basically. But my task here today is to find support for the Book of Mormon in the ancient glyphic system of the classic Maya period. We need to approach this topic with caution, because the Maya didn't even begin to flourish until after the Nephite civilization was basically decimated. And we frankly don't know if there's any linguistic connection between the Book of Mormon peoples and the Maya. Another great challenge to this task is the fact that the ancient Maya scribes were frustratingly laconic. They just didn't write that much. Their texts tend to be really short. And the subject matter is typically focused just on royal activities, specific dates and genealogies, and occasionally some activities. But despite the limited subject matter, I think there are some exciting correlations that we can make between the Book of Mormon passages and the Maya glyphs. Other early scholars have made some limited attempts to correlate specific glyphs to the Book of Mormon, and I would like to begin my discussion with a rather well-known example. The first one is the famous "It Came to Pass" glyph. But in the Book of Mormon, we actually have several different versions of this phrase. We have "it came to pass," "it had come to pass," and "it shall come to pass," to name a few. And in glyphic studies, we would call these date indicators. And we have a very similar variety among the Maya inscriptions. For example, we have, oops, wrong button. Udi, which means "since it came to pass," Iud, the famous "then it came to pass," and Utom, "it shall come to pass." And so the similarities between the meaning of these glyphs and the wording in the Book of Mormon is really quite striking. One of the fundamental characteristics that bind the various Mesoamerican groups together is the use of multiple calendars, the most basic of which is the 260-day calendar, or the Tzolk'in. I should note that the Tzolk'in is not the name that the ancient Maya used. It's a name that we archaeologists have given to this cycle. We don't know what they themselves called it, but we do know that they had this 260-day cycle. And the way it works, you have the numbers, the numbers 1 through 13, and they cycle with 20 named days, kind of like we have the numbers 1 through 30 or so, and they cycle with day names Monday through Sunday. And in order to get back to this first date, it would take 260 days. So the first day would be 1 Emish, then 2 Ek, etc., and then you eventually end up at 13 Ahau after 260 days. Now, if you ask an epigrapher or a Mayanist, what's so significant about 260 days, the answer is, we're not sure. There's no astronomical cycles that line up with that. So they typically say it approximates the human gestation cycle of 9 months. And then they just kind of leave it at that because we're really not sure. I don't have any extra insight into the meaning of this calendar, but for the purpose of this paper, I think that there is a reference to this in the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Omni, we read that Coriantumr was discovered by the people of Zarahemla, and that he dwelt with them for the space of 9 moons. The phrase 9 moons always struck me as odd, but in a Mesoamerican context, it makes perfect sense. What Omni is really telling us is that Coriantumr dwelt with the people of Zarahemla for 1 Tzolk'in, or 1 cycling of the sacred calendar, and that imbues this event with a heightened level of both historic and religious significance. Now, one criticism that has been leveled against the Book of Mormon is that it suggests a 7-day week, such as when Abinadi teaches that the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, or when the Zoramites gathered themselves together on 1 day of the week. Critics argue that there's no evidence for such a reckoning among the Maya. However, there are a couple of little understood glyphs that are found only in calendric sequences, and they're known as Glyph Y and Glyph Z. We don't know how to read these phonetically, but we know that they only take a coefficient of 5 or 7, and they always appear in calendric contexts. And so this suggests a 7-day cycle. Just as with the day glyphs and the Tzolk'in, you'll never find a number higher than 13 because it's a 13-day cycle. In John Montgomery's textbook, How to Read the Maya Hieroglyphs, he says a 7-day count, referred to by the letters Y and Z, ran concurrently with all of the other cycles of the Maya calendar. Even more rare than this 819-day count, glyphs Y and Z cycle through coefficients 1 through 7 in a kind of secondary week. Significantly, the 1819-day cycle that he refers to can only be explained by multiplying the numbers 13 times 9 times 7. There are more clearly understood 9 and 13-day cycles, and that virtually demands that there's a 7-day cycle to complete this 819-day cycle. Other earlier scholars have noted another significant calendric correlation between the Book of Mormon and Mesoamerica and the shared importance of the Baktun and the Katun. A Baktun is a period of 400 years, which is made up of 20 Katuns, or 20-year periods. The Maya long count always begins with a count of exactly how many Baktuns and Katuns have passed since the time of creation on August 13, 3114 BC. The clearest examples of the Baktun in the Book of Mormon can be found in Alma 45:10, and they're echoed in Helaman 13. In Alma we read, "Behold, I perceive that this very people, the Nephites, according to the spirit of revelation which is in me, in 400 years from the time that Jesus Christ shall manifest himself unto them, shall dwindle in unbelief." Mormon points to the fulfillment of this 400-year prophecy in Mormon 8:6. And the final date mentioned in the very last chapter of the Book of Mormon, the very last date we have, it has Moroni saying, "I would that they should know that more than 420 years have passed away since the sign was given of the coming of Christ." Or in other words, 1 Baktun and 1 Katun have passed away. These are clearly significant numbers to the people of the Book of Mormon, and inarguably significant to the ancient Maya as well. So this is back one. That's the 400-year period, the Baktun, and that's the Katun. So more than 420 years have passed away. The Ha suffix. There's an interesting naming convention that is used in both the Book of Mormon and Mesoamerica that I believe is worth mentioning. The Maya had many cities, such as Lakamha, Atunha, Yashha, to name but a few, that obviously had Ha as a suffix. The Ha ending in Mayan translates as by the water, and all cities that bear these names are in fact located near lakes or other sources of water. Other LDS scholars have noted that this naming practice can similarly be found among the Book of Mormon in names such as Mathonaiha, Ammonaiha, or Nephihah. And significantly, Alma explicitly tells us the city of Nephihah is located by the East Sea. So we have the same naming practice used among the Maya and the Book of Mormon. Speaking of water, there's a little understood metaphor for death that is found in the Maya glyphs that reads Och-ha. So this top element here reads Och, and the one below it reads Ha. The glyph from the last slide, the Ha by the water, is the same. It represents a water lily, is what that's supposed to be, and means water. A variety of explanations have been offered for why Ochha is a metaphor for death, why entering the water is a metaphor for death. And it typically deals with the watery depths of the underworld or the watery sky band. But for my own field work among the Chortí Maya of eastern Guatemala, which was funded by the Ancient America Foundation, which I should thank them for that, I've come to the conclusion that it has reference to the burial ceremony itself, which is called Hocha among the modern Chortí. Now, whether my exact interpretation is right or wrong, it doesn't matter, because all scholars agree that entering the water is a metaphor for death. It's clear in the glyphs. Now, with this in mind, I believe a few passages from the Book of Mormon become more poignant. In Alma chapters 2, 3, and 44, we have a record of the battles that the Nephites had with the Lamanites and the Amlicites along the banks of the river Sidon, and the manner in which they disposed of the bodies. In the aftermath, it says, "And it came to pass that they did cast their dead into the waters of Sidon, and they have gone forth and are buried in the depths of the sea." I can easily imagine Moroni standing heartbroken before this awful scene of death and carnage, ordering that the dead enter the water. Another approach to entering the water expression in the Book of Mormon may be understood within the context of baptism. We know that baptism represents the death, burial, and the resurrection of Christ, but the Book of Mormon actually doesn't spell that out. The phrasing in Mosiah 18, 14, and 5 is very suggestive of this, in that it states that Alma and Helam were buried, or mukach in Mayan, in the water when Helam was baptized, but that Alma did not bury himself again. And burial typically has a context with death. And it is further implied in passages such as Alma 7:14. "Now I say unto you that we must repent and be born again. For the Spirit saith, if you are not born again, you cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. Therefore come and be baptized unto repentance, that ye may be washed from your sins, that ye may have faith on the Lamb of God, who taketh away the sins of the world, who is mighty to save and to cleanse from all unrighteousness." The Maya did have a concept of being born again, in both the symbolic sense of spiritual renewal and the literal sense of resurrection. In order to obtain the latter, a physical death was necessary. Now these glyphs, in honesty, these glyphs don't appear together in the inscriptions, but they do have all these. So basically, they enter the water, so they die, they're buried, and then they're born. And I stole this picture from Brother Rain. I hope I didn't steal his thunder from his presentation that's next. It was much to the surprise of the Spanish conquistadors that baptism was already known and practiced by Mesoamericans, and the form and function of it bears striking resemblance to the way it's described in the Book of Mormon. The following quote comes from the famous Bishop Diego de Landa's Yucatan Before and After the Conquest. It's one of the most well-known colonial source conquest era document that we have. And this translation comes from William Gates. He says, "Baptism is not found anywhere in the Indies save here in the Yucatan, and even with the word meaning to be born anew or a second time, the same as the Latin word renacer. Thus, in the language of Yucatan, sahil means to be born anew or a second time, but only, however, in composition. Thus, kaput sahil means to be reborn. Its origin we have been unable to learn, but it is something that they have always used and for which they have had such devotion that no one fails to receive it. They had such reverence for it that those guilty of sins, or who knew that they were about to sin, were obliged to confess to the priest in order to receive it. And they had such faith in it that in no manner did they take it a second time. They believed that in receiving it, they acquired a predisposition to good conduct and habits, protection against being harmed by the devils in their earthly affairs, and that through it, in living a good life, they would attain a beatitude hereafter, which, like that of Muhammad, consisted in eating and drinking. As LDS apologist Jeff Lindsay has stated, this major Maya ritual was associated with being born again, purification, cleansing from sin, confession of sins to a priest, changing one's nature to be a better person, and gaining salvation in the afterlife. And I would refer anybody that's interested in learning more about baptismal practice in Mesoamerica to Brother Lindsay's website. I actually had come up with this on my own. I discovered it independently, if you will. And as I was putting this together, I realized that he had argued it much more eloquently than I have. Now, while critics may argue that being born again was a buzzword in Joseph Smith's day, and that the Book of Mormon reads like a 19th century revival meeting, it was just as clearly a buzzword among the ancient Maya and cannot be dismissed as easily. For the ancient Maya, death was necessary for life, and they were deeply religious about the cycle of death and rebirth, as evidenced by the many scenes of resurrection depicted on monuments and ceramics. Yeah, go back one. This is the maize god, and the earth represents, or the turtle represents the earth. That's how the Maya conceptualized the earth. And here we have the maize god being reborn out of the earth. And so very clearly, they understood the cycle of death and resurrection, and it was a belief that was widely held. Alma 5 and God impersonation. Alma 5 records a stirring sermon that Alma preached to the people in the church in Zarahemla around the year 83 BC. In verse 14, he poses a series of questions to his listeners that were intended to provoke deeper introspection into the state of their own souls. Modern readers have interpreted these questions in a variety of meaningful ways, but placing Alma's words into their original ancient Mesoamerican context reveals another level of meaning. An important ritual in Mesoamerican religion, both ancient and modern, is deity concurrence, also known as God impersonation. In deity concurrence, a ritual specialist puts on an engraved mask or elaborate headdress and transforms him or herself into the god whose mask or headdress they are wearing. So for example here, we have the ruler, that's his face, and then right in front of him you can see a little mask. That's what we call the X-ray vision. It's like a cutaway of the mask. And the other individuals, they all have masks on, or a headdress that kind of droops in front of the face. Having a mask or the headdress conceptually transformed them into a particular god. And in their minds, they weren't play acting. They would literally become that god. They would act as he would act and perform the godly duties pertaining to that particular deity. And there is a glyphic formula that essentially states his holy image, Ubahil, that of God X, is upon ruler Y. So literally, ruler Y receives God X into his countenance. There are many situations where deity concurrence takes place, and a wide variety of deities are impersonated, such as wind gods, gods of incense burning, gods of ball playing, even major gods such as the sun god or the supreme creator deity, Itzamna. This practice goes back to Olmec times, as attested to by cave paintings in Tenochtitlan dating to the 8th century BC. And so here we see the ruler sitting on his throne. That's his face, and then he's got the big mask on, and this is a scene of transformation of becoming that god. So if the Nephites were part of a larger Mesoamerican system, which we all believe they were, it seems plausible that a ritual of such significance to the larger society could find its way into apostate Nephite practices. Alma may have been speaking to this issue when he asked the wicked Nephites of Zarahemla, "Have you received his image in your countenances?" And he specified in verse 19 that it is the image of God that they needed to have engraven upon their countenances, rather than the numerous false gods that were being impersonated by the unbelieving elites. This interpretation is strengthened when we read that after Alma left Zarahemla and went to Gideon, he was complaining about Zarahemla's awful dilemma. And he said, "I trust that you do not worship idols like they do in Zarahemla, but that you do worship the true and living God." We should keep in mind that Alma's father was converted by Abinadi's powerful testimony, which included a recitation of the Ten Commandments and a charge not to make any graven images. The masks and headdresses that were worn were literally graven. We see here an artist carving these masks. And so Alma's unusual wording thus finds a comfortable fit within an ancient Mesoamerican context, and that supports the assertion that the Book of Mormon is exactly what it claims to be, an ancient American document. Mayan script and language also make metaphoric use of the head as a means of exaltation, of designating someone as the principal member of a particular category or person. Kind of like we do in English when we say head of state or head honcho. Head just means, the top, the best, the greatest. We find this exact same usage in the Book of Mormon, with such expressions as our great and eternal head, or in the declaration, under this head ye are made free, and there is no other head whereby you can be made free. Mesoamericans conceptualize buildings and natural features of the landscape in terms of the human body. For example, in both modern Mayan languages and in those of the colonial period, the doorway is the mouth of the house, the post its foot, and the ridgepole its head. The same holds true in the classic inscriptions. Ti means mouth, and it widely refers to doorway. And sometimes the opening of a building is literally depicted as a maw, or a wide open mouth. And so here we see these are the eyes, the eyelids, the big nose, and then this giant, nasty looking toothy mouth that you walk through in order to get into the temple. And so this understanding can help to illuminate a curious phrase that's found in Alma 40, verse 11, or verse 13. The spirit of the devil did enter into them and take possession of their house. From the context of this scripture, it is clear that the body is being likened to a house, and that is a concept that finds a very comfortable home, if you forgive the pun, in a Mesoamerican setting. As we have seen, different aspects of the physical body carry deep symbolic meaning to the ancient Maya. In Maya writing, individual parts of the body can represent an entire concept or action. Certain parts of the body were used metaphorically in the inscriptions with regularity, namely the head, the nose, the ears, the eyes, the mouth, the chest, the heart, the soul, blood, back, arms, feet. We turn again to Alma 5, and we find a stunning parallel to this Mesoamerican concept in the Book of Mormon. Alma 5 refers to virtually every aspect of the human body as conceptualized by the Maya. We've already discussed the head or the countenance in the deity impersonation ritual, but we also read of mouths that sing redeeming love, ears that hear the voice of the Lord, and the Cholti Mayan word for ears, by the way, is things for hearing. We read of seeing with the eye of faith, feeling the arms of mercy wrapping around us, having clean hands and a change of heart, and souls that can be illuminated. We also find turning your backs to the poor and trampling the Holy One under your feet, and the garments that are stained with blood. Alma conceives of a body that serves God with every limb and appendage from the inside out. We don't need to know Mayan to recognize this beautiful symbolism, but knowing that the Maya conceived of the body in similar terms strengthens our claim that it's an ancient book. I wish I had the time to explore this topic further, but I can't. But as a seminary teacher, I do want to encourage all of you to read Alma 5 again with an eye of faith, and hopefully you can feel this illumination of soul. John Welch's pioneering work with chiasmus in the late 60s has been heralded as one of our strongest evidences for the antiquity of the Book of Mormon. As all of you are surely aware, chiasmus is a poetic form of parallelism in which the first element of a strophe parallels the last, the second element parallels the next to last, etc., which focuses the attention on the central elements in order to highlight their importance. Perhaps the most beautiful and well-known example comes from Alma 36, where Alma is recounting the story of his conversion. And remembering and crying out to Jesus Christ is the focal point of the chiasm, which highlights its supreme importance in the narrative. While much work has been done on chiasmus in the Book of Mormon and in the Old World in general, much less has been written about chiasmus in the New World, especially in ancient contexts. Alan Christensen's translation and commentary on the Popol Vuh has shown that this poetic form is clearly present in the colonial period, but Christensen himself cautions that the Popol Vuh was compiled more than 1,000 years after the Book of Mormon record was completed, and its historical accounts refer in general to events dating no further back in time than the 13th century of Christ. We might by extension say that the literary forms found in colonial period documents are also 1,000 years too late, and so we should be cautious in assuming that those forms have gone unchanged for centuries. However, this poetic form continues to be used today in the sacred language and ritual of modern Maya groups, such as the Chorti, and Mesoamerican poetic discourse seems to have remarkable staying power. I'm now going to show you some glyphic examples of chiasmus from the classic period. But in the interest of academic integrity, I don't want to give you the impression that chiasmus was common in the glyphic system. We only have a few very clear examples of chiasmus, but the examples are clear. And even one clear example would suffice to show that they used this literary form in their writing. The first example comes from the west section of Step 6 of the hieroglyphic Stairway at Dos Pilas. I've given you a very abbreviated version of the translation, leaving out the dates, but basically we have a war against some city, it's eroded, and then same thing, the war against, and those are the first and last, and in the middle we have, it got burned, Dos Pilas, it got burned, some city whose name has been erased. So a very clear example of chiasmus and parallelism. Now in the Book of Mormon, we have this. This first part here is a parallel quatrain. It's another form of parallelism, not chiasmus. Behold, the city of Laman and the city of Josh and the city of Gad and the city of Kishkumen have I caused to be burned with fire and the inhabitants thereof. Then we go to the last strophe. I did send fire and destroy them because of their wickedness in casting out the prophets, and because they did cast them all out. And at the center of the chiasm, we have declare unto them concerning their wickedness and abominations. So what's striking to me is not only is the subject matter the same, the burning of cities, but the form of it is the same. They both use chiasmus. And I think that's a really striking parallel. Speaking of burning of cities, an important goal of military campaigns was to sack and burn the principal temple of an enemy community. Since all Maya temples were massive stone buildings, how exactly do you burn them? The Aztec codices clearly depict conquest by showing the roofs of temples collapsing and burning. So here's just one page from the Codex Mendoza. And these little glyphs right here with the hills, that was how they named their cities. So they're basically saying, this city was burned, so was this city, so was this city. And the little fire things coming out here, that just says it's burning, and then the roof is collapsing. And here's a frontal view of the temple at Tenochtitlan burning. The way they would do this was they would set fire to a wooden lintel. It's called a pacab in Maya. And they would span the doorways, and they would go deep. And so symbolically burning this lintel would destroy the temple. I mean, the whole temple is going to stay standing, but the roof is going to collapse. Now, the Book of Mormon obviously mentions the burning of cities, and where I want to go with this is actually talking about the lintels. These things were incredibly carved. This is a carved wooden lintel from Tikal Temple 4. Here's a line drawing of it. Just incredibly intricate, incredibly beautiful. And the reason I bring this up is because in Mosiah 11:8-10, it describes King Noah's temple that he built and the use of fine wood as part of his construction. And I think that may be what they're talking about, is these wooden lintels that were so intricately carved. Violence and warfare were basically the sacraments of the ancient Maya elites. And war is one of the most frequent subjects carved into their monuments. There are several expressions that are used to describe various aspects of warfare, and each can be found in the Book of Mormon. The most common one is huboi, which it's been variously translated as taken down, brought down, falls down, collapsed. A general term for conquest, that in scriptural language, we might say humbled to the earth. And all of these expressions are found in the Book of Mormon. We find the phrase brought down in a violent sense in 1 Nephi, 2 Nephi, Alma. Throw down is also used in 3 Nephi. For example, I will cut off the cities of thy land and throw down all thy strongholds. Falling, in the context of war and conquest, is used many, many times in Omni, Alma, Mormon, Ether, Moroni. The typical phrase for falling in the Book of Mormon is falling by the sword. And we find a powerful example of this whole concept of things being brought down low when Moroni marches against the kingmen in Alma 51. In 5 verses, he says, the author uses the phrase pull down, hewn down, smitten down, brought down, breaking down, just really emphasizing the point that they were brought down. And so all of Moroni's phrases find a comfortable fit in a Mesoamerican concept. I'm sorry, go back one. Another glyph dealing with warfare that is frequently found in the inscriptions is that of decapitation, or chak, cut off the head. Decapitation is mentioned a couple of times in the Book of Mormon, most famously with Nephi taking Laban's head. But in the New World, events of decapitation only take place during the Jaredite period. In Ether 8, the conspiring Jared demands the head of his own father as a trophy so he could ascend to the throne. When we read that in Ether 9, that Jared's plan backfired and he lost his own head while sitting upon the very throne he had usurped. Here we have a ruler sitting upon his throne and the head of a decapitated captive being displayed before him. Ether 15:30-31 recounts the exhausting battle between Coriantumr and Shiz, where Shiz famously loses his head as Coriantumr rests upon his sword. Also of interest is the phrase in 1 Nephi 22:13, the sword of their own hands shall fall upon their own heads, which may be interpreted as an act of self-decapitation, something that is also attested to epigraphically and iconographically among the Maya. And here we have, this is actually a god, it's God A Prime, and he's cutting off his own head with this obsidian axe. As we just looked at, we saw some thrones. In order to get on the throne, you have to exceed. the Mayan glyph for accession and rulership was chumlach, which literally means to be seated. And this isn't a very good example of the glyph, but it's actually supposed to represent, imagine a head up here looking this way, and that's the back, and then that's the leg coming forward. So that's kind of like a thigh, and that's a back. And so chumlach literally is to be seated, and that's what the glyph itself represents. And so these rulers would be seated upon their tzam, their thrones. And they typically like to depict themselves being surrounded by an audience of other nobles or even humbled captives, as we saw a couple of slides ago. A clear example of this comes from Ether 9:5 in the Book of Mormon, where we read that King Jared was beheaded as he sat upon his throne giving audience to his people. Another common expression for warfare is the couplet Tokpakal, which literally translates as flint shield. The flint refers to the flint-lined wooden swords that were commonly used in Mesoamerican warfare. And here we see, this is an Aztec image actually, of Nezahualcóyotl, and that's his obsidian-lined, his wooden sword that's lined with obsidian, and then his shield. And so what they do is by combining these two concepts, by combining the tools of warfare, they were creating the concept of warfare. We find this expression in the Book of Mormon as well. In Ether 15:24, it tells us, they contended with their might, with their swords, and with their shields. The same couplet that we find in the ancient glyphic system. Another glyph associated with warfare is loqui, which means escaped or came out. It's literally the Spanish translation. The Spanish word is salir, to leave, but it's usually in the context of fleeing. And there are countless examples of individuals in the Book of Mormon who are described as either escaping or fleeing. So again, we find a comfortable fit with what we have in the glyphic system and the Book of Mormon. The taking of captives was a major source of pride for Maya rulers. A common royal title is he of X amount of captives. For example, the famous ruler of Yaxchilan, Bird Jaguar, his title was he of 20 captives. They would brag about how many they got. And rulers like to depict themselves seated upon their throne surrounded by their captives. So again, we have the same image. And so the ruler's surrounded by his captives. They typically have their hands bound behind their back. And then we've got the guy here with the shield. I don't know if that's flint exactly, but they've got their weapons of war, the king on his throne, the captives tied up in front of him. The Book of Mormon nails this one right on the head. In Alma 17:20, we read, "And as Alma entered the land of Ishmael, the Lamanites took him and bound him, as was their custom to bind all the Nephites who fell into their hands, and carried them before the king. And thus it was left to the pleasure of the king to slay them," okay, or to retain them in captivity, these guys, or to cast them in prison, or to cast them out of his land according to his will and pleasure. A rather grisly expression found among the Maya glyphs is associated with captives. The verb is kushah, and has been variously translated as to hurt, to grind, or to be eaten. In other words, they were cannibalized. Again, we find a perfect match in the Book of Mormon. In Moroni 9:8, we read, "And the husbands and fathers of those women and children they have slain, and they feed the women upon the flesh of their husbands, and the children upon the flesh of their fathers, and no water, save a little, do they give unto them." Hints from the Book of Omni. We already talked about Coriantumr and his dwelling for 9 moons. Excuse me. The Book of Mormon also provides several other striking Mesoamericanisms. Omni 118 informs us that multiple language groups were living in close proximity to each other, a situation clearly paralleled in Mesoamerica. In verse 19, we learn that Mosiah was enthroned as king over Zarahemla, which is kind of curious since he had only recently arrived and didn't speak the local language. But among the Maya, we do have clear instances of a high-profile foreigner coming into a city and becoming its king. The most famous example of this comes from the inscriptions at Tikal. It's one of the Maya superpowers. On January 31st of 378 AD, a Teotihuacan lord named Siak, this guy right here, Siak, we saw that earlier, the born glyph, and fire, born of fire. He came into Tikal, and the unfortunate ruler of Tikal, Chaktoki Chak I, entered the water, and he died. And yet that is what it actually says. And although Siak Kak didn't take the throne himself, he installed Yashnunain I, who was the son of Teotihuacan's emperor, spear thrower Owl. So Siak Kak was working under the authority of spear thrower Owl, overthrew Tikal, and put spear thrower Owl's son, on the throne, a foreigner king acceding to power, just like we have in Mosiah. But perhaps my favorite direct hit from Omni comes from verse 20, where it states that a large stone was brought before Mosiah with engravings on it. Now we all know that the creation of large stone monuments called stela was common practice for ancient Mesoamericans, something that was of course unknown at the time Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. The classic Maya glyph for stela looks like this. It was originally translated as Tetun. They thought that looked like a little tree, and then that reads phonetically as tun. And so based on this translation, Linda Sheely named her famous book, Forest of Kings, sort of as a homage to this, because the stela kind of were big and tall like trees, and they were all over the Maya area, so it was like a forest. The problem is, this doesn't read te, it doesn't read tree. What this glyph means is lakam, and lakam translates as large stone. Literally word for word what Mosiah tells us. So what Mosiah is saying is they brought a lakam tun, a stela to him. I love that. Kuhulwanik. A common phrase that means religious specialist in the classic period inscriptions is kuhulwanik, which literally translates as holy man. And it typically has priestly connotations. We find this exact phrase used to describe King Benjamin in Words of Mormon 1:17 and to describe Alma in Alma 10, 7 and 9. This is the glyph Kuhulwanik. The word Kuhul, though, actually carries connotations of more than just holiness. It carries with it a sense of divinity or ultimate sacredness. And the Maya kings often liken themselves unto gods, and the people seem to buy into it, into the awesome and fearful spectacles that were created to validate the king's power. And perhaps this is why Benjamin himself cautions his people, I have not commanded you to come up hither that you should fear me, or think that I of myself am more than a mortal man. I'm not a god, he's telling them. Maybe a holy man, but not a god. We know that he spoke to him from the temple, and temples always played a central role in both Mesoamerica and the Book of Mormon. Temples are mentioned 31 times in the Book of Mormon. There is a specific glyph for temple in the ancient inscriptions, but unfortunately we don't have a secure phonetic reading for this glyph. The way we figure out how glyphs are pronounced is by alternate spellings, and we don't have any alternate spellings for this. However, the colonial period sources tell us that the Yucatec Mayan word for temple is kuna, and it has the exact same meaning as the Nahuatl word for temple, which is teocalli, and they both literally translate to God house, or we might say the house of the Lord. And as Brother Hadlock showed us, Bethel in the Bible has the same meaning in Genesis 28. Although the general forms and functions of the temples were related throughout Mesoamerica, the specific deities and cult paraphernalia they housed and the ritual staged at them had strong local associations. In other words, every Maya city had its own set of gods, and no two cities had exactly the same pantheon. Major polities such as Tikal, Caracol, Naranjo, Palenque, they each had their own distinct triad of deities, and no two cities had the same triad. This is the, could you go back one? Sorry. This is the famous Palenque triad. We can't read their names phonetically. We call him G1 for God 1, G2, G3. We actually recently gave a phonetic version of this as Unen Kawil, baby fire god. But the triads are different at each site. And very few of these gods have their names spelled phonetically. And so we have to rely on nicknames to identify them, like G1, G2, G3. And even non-Maya cities in Mesoamerica that date to the same time, to the 5th century, had triads. There's one that we call the Tikisate Trinity, whose members have been named Curly Face, Beady Eye, and Sour Mouth. The point I would like to get across is that the Nephites would have fit perfectly well into the larger Mesoamerican environment by having a localized triad of deities. And in their case, we know their names: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The argument that there is no evidence for Nephite religion in Mesoamerica is a very difficult one to prove, since each and every polity had its own unique localized set of gods, and only 0.5% of Maya sites have been excavated. And of those sites that are pictured, where the gods are pictured, only a scant handful have names that we can actually read. And when the experts resort to giving names like Curly Face, Beady Eye, and Sour Mouth, how much can we truly say we understand their religion? Recent texts have been unearthed that shed new light on the religious beliefs and practices of the Maya at Palenque. There's one text in particular that I believe might be of special interest to the Latter-day Saints, although it is not something explicitly taught in the Book of Mormon. The text in question comes from a large tablet recently excavated at Temple 19 in Palenque. This is the tablet right here. It's carved into stucco. It's beautifully engraved. Palenque is famous for its intricate artwork. The tablet has a long text that borders the main scene, and there's several individuals pictured here. And what we're looking at is an accession scene. This guy is being placed into rulership by his priest here. What is significant to us as Latter-day Saints is that the text explicitly states, oh, I'm sorry. I need to go back a second. The first part of this lengthy text on the left side here, it's a retelling of the accession of the god G1. And he's placed into office as king by the supreme creator deity, Yashnat Itzamnah. And so what we're seeing here is a recreation of G1 being placed into office by the supreme God. We even have this text here, it spells it out explicitly. Uti homol chumlak tiahaulel G1 ukabhi Yashnat Itzamnah iud tavuchan. What this is saying is, it came to pass on the 5th day of the month Mol, G1 was seated in rulership, and it happened under the authority of Yashnat Itzamnah, and it happened in the resplendent heavens. Later in the text, it tells us that G1 was born a few hundred years later. Now, when I was at the Maya meetings in Texas, all the experts were kind of scratching their head. They're like, how could this have happened before he was even born? And then after David Stewart presented this, Cal Tolman and some of the other people that were there, we got together and we're like, that makes sense to us. Right? We don't have a problem with people doing things before they were born. But I believe our understanding of foreordination at the Grand Council in Heaven gives us an understanding that is inaccessible to non-members. We know that Christ was chosen to be the King of Kings before this world was. And as the psalmist so eloquently tells us, who is this King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty. But the individuals pictured in the scene aren't gods. Rather, oh, I translated it for you. There you go. These people aren't gods. But I showed you this glyph earlier. That's Ubahil and Ubahil. Ubahil, Yashnat Itzamnah, this guy. This guy is taking on the image of the supreme creator deity, Yashnat Itzamnah. And he's wearing the headdress. So he has transformed himself into Yashnat Itzamnah. The king here, Kenich Akang Monab, he takes on the image of G1. And so they're literally recreating this event, and the text spells it out explicitly. This whole story should resonate with those of us who have been to the temple. It is there that we reenact our own creation mythology, even to the point of impersonating certain characters from that mythology. And it is there that we are anointed to be rulers. I was talking to Cal Tolman right before I came up here, and we were talking about Palenque. He mentioned that the famous sarcophagus lid from Palenque shows the resurrection scene of Kinich Pakal the Great. And in one hand he's holding a sphere, and in another hand he's holding a cube. And I won't go into detail further here, but maybe I'll write something up in the future. In conclusion, new and exciting archaeological discoveries are being made on a regular basis in Mesoamerica, such as last month's announcement regarding the discovery of Olmec writing. It is a very exciting time to be a Mesoamerican archaeologist, but even more exciting to me is seeing the many ways in which the archaeological record bears witness to the historicity of the Book of Mormon. I'm reminded of Moses chapter 6, verse 63, which tells us, all things were created and made to bear record of me, saith the Lord, both things which are temporal and things which are spiritual, things which are in the heavens above and things which are on the earth, and things which are in the earth and things which are under the earth, both above and beneath, all things bear record of me. I believe the things that we have looked at today fulfill this verse in some small measure. The Maya texts that we have literally come from within the earth and have been brought to light through archaeology. When I read the Maya hieroglyphs, I see a record being born that Jesus is the Christ, and I hope today I have shed a little more light on these texts and helped to open your eyes to these witnesses as well. Thank you. Questions?